Welcome to this explainer. When we think of the United States Constitution today, it's super easy to picture this group of unified visionaries drafting a totally flawless document handed down from on high. But the reality? It was absolutely nothing like that. The Constitution wasn't some unanimous creation born out of perfect harmony. No, it was a highly pragmatic, incredibly contentious tool forged through high stakes and, frankly, very messy compromises. And understanding those compromises, that's the absolute key to understanding why our government functions, or, let's be real, gridlocks, the way it does today. So let's dive right into the real history of how this foundational document was actually built.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to start with the rebellion's warning, then move right into designing a new government. Third is the representation compromise. Fourth is the ratification battle, and we'll wrap things up with rights and dark compromises.
All right, part one, the rebellion's warning.
Picture this. It's 1786, just a few years after the American Revolution ended. We're operating under the Articles of Confederation, and honestly, it is not going well. The federal government is weak. So weak it has absolutely no way to raise revenue. Meanwhile, you've got thousands of farmers in western Massachusetts struggling under crushing debt, literally facing foreclosure on their properties. They beg their state government for help, but the state actually sides with wealthy lenders and bondholders instead. And the federal government, completely powerless to intervene. So faced with losing their livelihoods, many of these men, including Revolutionary War veterans, take up arms. Led by a veteran named Daniel Shays, these armed Shayites resort to familiar patriot tactics. They physically blockade courthouses to stop judges from issuing foreclosure orders. Now, to the Shayites, they were just carrying on the true spirit of 1776, protecting their rights. But to leaders like Massachusetts Governor James Boudin, they were violent anarchists trying to rule through mob violence. In fact, Governor Boudin called up thousands of militiamen under a former revolutionary general just to crush the uprising and prevent what they saw as a state of total anarchy, confusion, and slavery.
The fallout from Shays' rebellion sparked an intense national debate, and it completely terrified nationalists like James Madison of Virginia. While some folks, like Thomas Jefferson, thought a little rebellion now and then was kind of healthy, Madison looked at the chaos in Massachusetts and saw the ultimate proof that the nation was sliding straight into anarchy. So the really crucial takeaway here is that for Madison, the rebellion proved the U.S. desperately needed a much stronger central government to avoid mob rule. It led him to this profound realization that liberty could actually be endangered by the abuses of liberty just as much as by the abuses of power.
Moving on to part two, designing a new government. That brings us to the summer of 1787. We're shifting from literal battlefields in Massachusetts to intellectual ones in the Assembly Room at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. In the sweltering heat of that summer, delegates from 12 of the 13 states, Rhode Island actually completely refused to show up, arrived with clear instructions. They were supposed to simply revise the Articles of Confederation and figure out how to pay back that massive Revolutionary War debt. But James Madison, he had a totally different agenda. He'd spent the previous year doing this massive deep dive, researching the history of republics all over the world. He didn't want to just fix the articles, he secretly planned to scrap them entirely and introduce a completely new national constitution.
Madison brought this daring research to the floor in what became known as the Virginia Plan, and this set up the absolute core conflict of the convention. The Virginia Plan pitched a strong federal government with three distinct branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. But here's the kicker. Representation in the legislature would be based strictly on a state's population size or tax base. Naturally, the big states loved this, but conventional wisdom at the time said republics had to be small, right? So the smaller states were absolutely terrified of being swallowed up. Enter William Paterson with the New Jersey Plan. This proposed keeping the existing system where every single state, regardless of size, got one equal vote. The battle lines were officially drawn.
Which leads us perfectly into part three, the representation compromise.
This whole disagreement over representation turned into the central, gridlocked fight of the entire convention. Because it wasn't just about who got more seats in a room, representation influenced absolutely everything else they were trying to build, from the executive branch all the way to the deeply divisive issue of slavery. To break this massive gridlock, Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman proposed what we now call the Great Compromise, and this is literally the foundation of the U.S. Congress today. They essentially mashed up elements of both the Virginia and New Jersey plans. The lower house, the House of Representatives, would keep the big states happy with proportional representation based on state population. But the upper house, the Senate, would satisfy the small states with equal representation. Every state would get exactly 2 senators who could vote independently. It was this incredibly delicate, brilliant balancing act just to keep the whole convention from completely falling apart. But trust me, they weren't done arguing. The delegates spent even longer trying to figure out the executive branch. I mean, should executive power be held by a committee or by a single person? When James Wilson at Pennsylvania suggested giving executive power to a single individual, things got incredibly contentious. Remember, this is only 4 years after the American Revolution. The mere idea of a single leader conjured up terrifying images of an elected monarchy. They debated endlessly about how to prevent corruption, and ultimately decided in September that this single president wouldn't actually be chosen directly by the people, but by a special electoral college.
All right, part 4, the ratification battle.
On September 17, 1787, the Constitutional Convention finally signed off on this new, highly controversial scheme. But putting ink to paper in Philadelphia was only half the battle. The Constitution now faced this brutal, state-by-state fight for approval in special ratification conventions. The country instantly split into 2 fiercely opposed camps, battling it out in newspapers, sermons, and coffeehouse arguments all across America. On one side, you've got the anti-federalists. They looked at this powerful new federal government and argued that without a specific, guaranteed Bill of Rights, ordinary citizens were seriously risking losing their personal liberty to tyranny. On the flip side were the Federalists, led by heavy hitters like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, who penned the famous Federalist Papers. The Federalists argued that listing specific rights was actually a dangerous move. Their logic was, if you write down exactly what rights people have, future leaders might just assume those are the only rights they have. The ratification process itself was absolutely grueling. After the signing in September 1787, it was just this slow, agonizing crawl. Take Virginia, for example, the most populous state in the nation at the time. It was this massive showdown between Madison and influential anti-federalists like Patrick Henry. After nearly a month of intense debate in June 1788, Virginia narrowly ratified it by a vote of just 89 to 79. By July, they'd finally reached a majority of states, putting the Constitution into effect. But the fight just kept dragging on. New York barely passed it by 3 votes. And Rhode Island? Oh, they held out for a full year after George Washington was inaugurated as president, finally caving by a razor-thin margin of just 2 votes.
Let's look at Part 5, Rights and Dark Compromises.
Okay, so the Constitution is ratified, Washington is president, and the new government is up and running. Acting on a political promise he made just to get elected to the House of Representatives, James Madison totally reverses his earlier stance and actually champions the addition of 10 amendments in 1791, the very ones we know today as the Bill of Rights. But we have to understand the severe limits of these foundational rights. The Constitution and the 1791 Bill of Rights left huge portions of the population completely unprotected. Women found absolutely no special protections or guarantee of a voice. Many states restricted voting strictly to men who owned significant property. And, most glaringly, the institution of slavery didn't just continue to exist, it was actively condoned and legally protected by the exact same document designed to secure liberty.
And that brings us to 2 of the darkest acts of political bargaining at the convention. First up is the 3/5 rule. The Constitution basically allowed states to count 3/5 of their enslaved population specifically for the purpose of representation. Practically speaking, this meant that in southern districts with large enslaved populations, the political power and influence of white voters was artificially and massively inflated in Congress. Second, there was something literally called the Dirty Compromise. Northern delegates, many of whom were morally opposed to the transatlantic slave trade, agreed to legally protect the importation of enslaved people for 20 more years. And in exchange, South Carolina and Georgia delegates agreed to support commercial legislation that benefited New England. So human lives were literally being traded for commercial trade laws.
Now, the Atlantic slave trade did eventually resume until it was officially outlawed in 1808, but the reasons for that ban were highly pragmatic. First off, Britain was already prohibiting the trade, and the U.S. really didn't want to concede the moral high ground. Second, the incredibly successful Haitian Revolution, where enslaved people actually overthrew French colonial rule, deeply terrified white Americans who feared a similar armed uprising on their own soil. Finally, the massive 1803 Louisiana Purchase completely doubled the size of the U.S., shifting the economic focus away from importing laborers and toward a massive internal domestic slave trade. And since the 1808 ban severely lacked real enforcement, intercepted enslaved people were often just sold at auction by individual states anyway, which fully preserved the legal logic of owning human beings.
Which leaves us with a really profound question to reflect on as we wrap up this explainer.
Looking at the brilliant structural designs of the government right alongside these devastating human compromises, we have to ask ourselves, did the United States Constitution serve as a pure champion of securing liberty for the people, or was it, at its very core, a masterclass in pragmatically and sometimes brutally balancing competing powers, regional economies, and property? It is a deeply complex legacy, and understanding these messy compromises is really the only way to truly understand the government that operates today. Thanks so much for focusing in and learning with me.